We're on the cusp of the playoffs, but that doesn't mean we can't start the prep work for the 2024 NFL season. And of course, today that begins with the rookie wide receivers. Last week, we covered the rookie QBs, found a lot of things to love about a few guys, in particular, my new man crush, Jaden Daniels. But today, we're going to find out which wide receivers fit that criteria as well. Are there three actual studs at wide receiver to draft in this class? Let's talk about it here. And I will say, did in fact put this all together last night, looked at the numbers a little bit last night as well. And I think I have my takes workshopped, ready to go. But of course, appreciate all you guys being here with me. Shout out to the chat as always. Bindles reporting for Squirting, a chat you can only see here, of course, on Splash Play, the Squirt Squad, our beloved community. But I guess you could also see it on Pornhub, maybe. Chatterbait, I don't know. But appreciate Bindles being here reporting for Squirting. Let's talk about it. Let's start with the guy up top. And of course, if you're not familiar with these videos, this is like a real data look. This is not something where I'm putting together the fancy graphics, trying to make it really clean for you guys. I want you guys to see the data as I see it and talk about the flaws, the positives, all of that as we go through. Of course, talk about these guys one by one. And that's the main thing about this process. So keep that in mind. We're just looking at Excel spreadsheets today. Google Sheets is really what we're looking at, but it's going to be, I think, a helpful process for me, and of course, helpful process for you guys as well, as we saw last year, where a lot of people did have some quality success based off the rookie data we talked about. Fantasy Football Garage here. Yes, all the names, Bindles and Fantasy Football Garage. Two of my favorite guys. Glad to see you guys in here. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about Marvin Harrison. So I guess before we do that, the thing that I liked about last week was kind of reflecting on what we got wrong in 2023, in particular with those rookies. And honestly, if you compare some of the rookies that we have this year compared to the guys we had last year, I do feel like this is going to be a much better class. And obviously, we did see a lot of critiques of the 2023 rookies coming in. A lot of people with this finding reasons to nickel and dime. Jordan Addison, JSN, obviously with the year off that he had. Quentin Johnson, a lot of people didn't like him. I did like him a little bit more. That did not work out. What did we get wrong? I think some of the biggest things that I got wrong in particular last year was not focusing in on the targets per out run. Rashee Rice is a guy that we did highlight here. And the main thing I remember saying, and I did rewatch these videos as well, was looking at Rashee Rice and going, he went to SMU. Can he do this in the NFL? It's such a big leap in competition. And I do think there is something to being a guy with pretty good size who just earns a lot of targets. You can see on the screen here amidst all the data, Rashee Rice, a 38% target per out run rate, was a guy that was generating a lot of targets in college. Obviously, again, was at SMU where there was not a lot of competition for targets, but just the sheer act of earning targets is the big thing for him. At the same token, though, Xavier Hutchinson, a guy that barely saw the field this year for the Texans, was somebody that I did like a little bit as kind of a late draft pick dart throw, because of the fact that Houston had enough bodies in there, because of the fact that Hutchinson himself was not coming with high draft capital. The fact that he was a 38% target per out run rate guy did not really matter that much for Hutchinson. He just didn't see the field enough. So I think that's something to keep in mind, where draft capital matters, but the ability to earn targets is one that I think is going to be the key thing we look at here, in addition to the EPA metrics, of course, that we talk about. Puka Nacua, another guy, of course, that we talked about a little bit on this video last year. I just didn't get him, of course, talked about him in January. Even in the preseason, didn't really go enough to Puka, even though we started to take him in some best ball drafts. But he had a 46% target per out run rate last year. Was only running 17 routes per game because his coaches at BYU did not know what to do with him. For the most part, though, for Puka Nacua, it was there on tape. It was there in terms of the numbers as well, to see him getting a 46% target per out run rate, 0.332 EPA everywhere, 0.264 EPA playing out wide, despite being a smaller guy. So there were things to look at for Puka, and I kind of just didn't look at them enough because of the fact that he wasn't running a lot of routes. So we do want to keep that in mind here, where the combo of showing some outlier skills plus landing spot, I think, is the main thing. You can also make the case, too, for guys like Addison, guys like JSN, even guys like Quentin Johnson. I know we don't want to defend him very much at this point. These guys didn't land in spots where they were going to come in and have a shot to be an alpha targeter. They were not coming in as Garrett Wilsons. They were not coming in as, I guess even Chris Olave's, where there were guys maybe ahead of them in the pecking order, but there was definitely an expectation those guys would be wide receiver ones. And I think for the class last year, that was good. A lot of the guys that were just basically coming in being wide receiver twos, wide receiver threes, as kind of what the ceiling was for their rookie year. This year, I think it's going to be a different case. But let's get into this year, and let's start it out. Marvin Harrison once more. So Marvin Harrison, 35% target per out run rate. So again, he's getting close to that Rashee Rice, playing much better competition at Ohio State. Also 0.43 EPA per target. The one thing that's worrisome here is the avoided tackle rate. And that is something where I think for last year, I fell in love with the avoided tackle rate for Quentin Johnson. I don't think avoided tackle rate matters that much for wide receivers. That is one thing I've had to adjust in terms of how I view things, where avoided tackle rate for running backs, a great indicator of how much juice the guy has, how much juice the guy doesn't have. Their ability to miss tackles is a very important part of the process. Of course, guys at high volume that miss tackles, even better. The Nick Chubbs of the world, even though he got hurt this year, those are the guys that really add value because they're getting 20 touches a game and missing about a third of their tackles. If you can do that in the pros, like you are an elite back, you are an elite wide receiver, you are an elite quarterback, But for a wide receiver, for the most part, the fact that the voided tackle is not the main thing. It's about getting downfield. It's about getting air yards. It's about getting red zone targets. It's about getting that overall volume, that crush of work. So for the fact that Marvin Harrison is not that shifty, under a 10% avoided tackle rate, I'm not going to nickel and dime him for it. It does make Malik Nabers a little bit more impressive, but we'll talk about him in a moment. But a 32% avoided tackle rate for him compared to under 10% for Marvin Harrison. Harrison, though, again, just great numbers across the board. 14 intended air yards per target, 3.6 yards per route run. Again, we do also have that 35% target route run rate, almost 10 targets per game for Marvin Harrison. And he could have run even more routes. Only ran 28 routes per game, which is about 5 less than Odunze did for Washington. Of course, if I mispronounce names, give me some slack because I'm not actively pronouncing college football players' names on a weekly basis. But for Marvin Harrison, everything grades out as it's supposed to. He's great out wide, 7 targets a game, good for a 0.32 EPA. Even better out of the slot, not getting as much volume, 2.7 slot targets per game, but a 0.75 EPA per target. Under 10 air yards, 0.39 EPA per target. So making value out of those close range targets. A little bit shocking to see him not be good between 10 to 20 air yards. That's an area where I think a guy like Marvin Harrison, who is a good route runner, obviously his dad, one of the best route runners ever in football, definitely a guy that I would assume can make things work. I want to blame Ohio State more than I do want to blame Harrison, who's so good everywhere else. But it is odd to see that between 10, 20 air yards, moving past the sticks, basically, he's not that great of a player, or at least wasn't that great of a player this past year. Only 1.1 catches and negative 0.25 EPA are not impressive numbers. Deep throws, though, phenomenal on deep throws. 1.8 deep targets per game, of course, throws 20-plus air yards, 1.6 EPA per target. So to put that in context, of course, the Sports Info Solutions numbers that I always talk about here for regular season NFL, of course, playoff NFL, and for college football, it's basically what helps you see things a little bit more one-to-one. He's adding 1.6 points in terms of the estimated points added every time he's targeted downfield. That is an outlandish number. That's the kind of number that NFL players had for maybe 1 week of the season, 2 weeks of the season. Tyreek Hill was, I think, at a 1 EPA per target over the course of a year. So we don't expect Marvin Harrison to carry that 1.6 EPA per deep target into the NFL. But the fact that he's that good in college and also getting pretty good volume downfield, I think Harrison looks really good there. So just really baffling, again, this 10 to 20 air yards thing when he's that good downfield and also that good close to the line of scrimmage. But that's Marvin Harrison for you. 1.9 red zone targets a game. Of course, red zone targets are a little bit of a will stat for a team, not as much necessarily earning targets like you are everywhere else in the field. For Marvin Harrison, almost 2 red zone targets a game. He turned 91% of those into touchdowns, 0.74 EPA per target. Crazy numbers for him. He's incredibly good. Was getting also just about 1 target inside the 10-yard line per game. I was inside the 5, but I did change it inside the 10 this year. Let me just note that here. But point being, Harrison, a red zone threat, a downfield threat, a threat everywhere across the field to get targets. I think it depends on who goes number 1, of course, who's picking number 1, because the Bears, we'll see what happens. They fired Luke Getsy. It could be a sign they want to bring somebody else in for one more shot at restoring Fields to the potential glory he can have. Or it could mean they're going in a different direction to have a new offensive coordinator for the next QB. Tend to think that's a sign of bringing Fields back, though. If the Bears stay at 1 and take Harrison, I don't know that he gets the same workload because of DJ Moore being there, but he's probably going to get himself 7 to 8 targets a game that are really efficient and also really high upside. The issue is that if he is 7 to 8 targets per game, he's not going to avoid tackles to make those into big plays. So he kind of needs to be fed big plays a little bit more. But that said, it's all going to come down to landing spot for Harrison. And if he lands in the right spot, he could be better than Garrett Wilson, I think, in year 1. I think he can be better than Chris Olave in year 1. That's my personal belief. Obviously, people out there can certainly knock that opinion down if they want. But Harrison is just that guy to me. Great size, 6'4", 205. We'll see what he clocks in at the combine. But a big-bodied guy who plays like with the efficiency, the efficacy of a slot guy. He's everything. Like he's my dream boat. He's my guy here. He's my Jaden Daniels of wide receivers. Harrison is that guy, even though there are a couple other guys here that I think are going to look equally as good. Ohio State QB was downgraded a lot this year from Stroud to McCord. Yes, that's another thing too. Stroud, of course, the guy that we talked about creating value for guys and how I think that he's a guy that made Nico Collins this year as opposed to the inverse. I would say for CJ Stroud, that is a big downgrade, but the fact that Harrison's numbers have held pretty steady. Last year, he was at, let's see, where are his numbers? Last year he was at a 0.56 EPA per target. This year, 0.43. So still an outlier, but not as much of an outlier. 0.5 EPA per target out wide last year compared to 0.32. So like you see the ding here. You see where things got worse. But Harrison himself being so good is what's propping this up here, where the numbers are still really good. Harrison, again, the QB downgrade still looks really good across the board, but the numbers are a little bit less good than last year. So I guess it's the one thing you critique him for, but it does speak to the fact that like if Harrison gets a mid QB in the NFL, he's probably still going to be a very good player. If he gets a CJ Stroud level QB, a guy who creates value at every level of throwing, he's going to be an outlier player. He's going to be a superstar player. So Harrison, to me, again, luscious lips, you can see on the thumbnail, which I know people don't talk about enough in rookie previews. Last week, we're looking up shirtless guys. Today, I'm talking about Marvin Harrison's luscious lips. But point being, though, Harrison, to me, is like the number one guy. I think Jaden Daniels is going to be my favorite fantasy football prospect overall. But Marvin Harrison, there's a lot more ways that he can get right and a lot less susceptibility, I think, for the situation. So Harrison could be great in the right situation, but he's going to be good in a bad situation, too. And I think that's where Harrison works for me. All right. Let's see what else we got here. We got Odunze at number 2. Rome ran the most routes of the class, 32.6 routes per game, 9.4 targets on that. So the targets per route run a little bit lower, a little bit closer to that Quentin Johnson, a little bit closer to that territory that JSN, Jordan Addison last year. So that's, I guess, one thing you could ding Odunze for. That said, Odunze's numbers look good. We looked at Penix last week. Penix was a big disappointment in the advanced analytics last week, where I really thought he was going to be a guy, at least had some merits downfield. He was not as good as his classmates downfield, was not as good in terms of the accuracy metrics, the catchable ball metrics. So we could maybe give Odunze some grace that his QB just might not be as good as people thought he was playing in the Pac-12. And the Pac-12 is, as I know as a USC fan, competitive if you're USC in Washington, but not as good as some other conferences out there. So Odunze, I think for what we can get out of him, 154 air yards per game is it, 16.5 intended air yards per attempt, 9.4 targets per game. So we're basically seeing kind of an elevated Jalen Hyatt out of Odunze here, where he's getting downfield, getting a lot more volume of targets, a less gimmicky offense as well than a Jalen Hyatt. So I think that all looks good for Odunze. Yards after catch, not that good. So we're not seeing a guy creating after the catch, which is not everything. The ability to earn those targets downfield is the main thing for most wide receivers. So still like Odunze, but again, he could be adding more value. Could be a guy that also breaks catches downfield. That would make him more of a Tank Dell type, I suppose. But for Odunze in the spot, I think that nothing here jumps out as bad. And I think, if anything, more things jump out as good than not. Harrison, best wide receiver prospect in a long time. I've seen him drafted number 3 wide receiver in dynasty startups after JJ and Chase. Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with it. There's nothing that I'm seeing from Harrison that makes me feel differently. I've watched a little bit of Harrison tape just because I've been curious, because he really graded out extremely well for me last year. He would have been my top wide receiver in last year's class as well. I think for Harrison, the one thing that jumps out of looking at Harrison, Odunze, and Nabers, I think Harrison is great. Odunze and Nabers' numbers, though, are not that far off at all. So I think that's where you can maybe critique Harrison, is that he's going to go at an extreme premium. If you get Odunze at 10 or Nabers at 10 or even at 15 or 20 somehow, like, I think those guys might be better relative to the draft capital spent. But obviously, all these guys are in play. And to spoil it, like, I think that we have 3 legit fantasy stud wide receivers in this class, and maybe 4. But I'll bury the lead at number 4. We'll look at that in a moment. Let's see. Jalen McMillan is one of my favorite wide receivers in college football. Hasn't declared yet. He was not on the CBS list, but let's see. Oh, I can see if I can add him in, because I'm sure his numbers are in here. Some guys, too, when you see somebody on the screen that does not have, did I spell this correctly? Oh, yeah, so he just doesn't have enough targets to qualify. Some of these guys here don't have enough targets to qualify for the overall metrics, where it only tracks, I believe, or only exports top 100 receivers in a class. So for Jalen McMillan, for Lad McConkey, for Moose Muhammad, and for Mario Williams, we don't have enough data to look at their overall picture. But frankly, these guys, if you're not getting enough targets to make the top 100, kind of think that speaks for itself as to where you should land in an NFL kind of preview thing. But either way, Jalen McMillan does not qualify, it looks like, in terms of the targets earned. Odunze, though, 0.44 EPA per target overall, 0.46 EPA out wide, 0.32 EPA in the slot. Obviously, out wide is where you'd like to see him, as a 6'3" guy, 215 pounds, the listed weight for him, according to CBS's mock draft. He's great, though. 0.12 close to the line, so maybe that's the one thing you critique him for, is he's not great by the line of scrimmage, but who cares if you're getting downfield like Odunze does? 0.12 EPA on throws of under 10 air yards, but a 0.76 EPA on throws of 10 to 20 air yards. So we are seeing a pretty big difference here, where you move him past the sticks. He looked a lot better than Marvin Harrison this year. Of course, Harrison last year, though, yeah, Harrison had none of these flaws, 10 to 20 air yards last year. So 0.645 EPA per target and 10 to 20 air yards last year, compared to a negative 0.25 this year. Got to think that's more of a QB thing for Harrison, but it is still, for whatever it's worth, the numbers are the numbers. Odunze does look a lot better in that mid-range of the field than Harrison did, at least in 2023. Downfield, Odunze, a lot of volume, but again, we did talk about this with Penix. Penix was not as good downfield as you would think for guys, a willing downfield thrower, and that's like his primary trademark. He got 2.88 targets per game, but only caught 50% of them. Good for a 0.66 EPA. So we're talking about him being about 1/3 as effective of Malik Nabers, about 1/3 as effective of Marvin Harrison. So that's not great for Odunze, but he did get the volume. Being a target earner is a skill. And again, Odunze, I don't want to downgrade him too much for that, especially given that we saw Penix's numbers and they weren't that great. Do you think you could critique Odunze a little bit more for this negative 0.45 EPA in the red zone per target? That's not the best for him. Got 1.3 red zone targets per game, 0.5 inside the 10-yard line per game, negative EPAs on both. So he was not a great red zone player. Again, if I'm going to give cover for him, Penix was also not great in the red zone. And Penix, his catchable ball rate, his accuracy rates were really low for what I thought. So Odunze, I see flaws in Odunze, but I kind of think we have to separate Odunze from some of them because the flaws align completely with where Penix was. Who you want to assign blame for might come down to who you like more. I think Odunze's athletic metrics, I'm curious to see because I don't know that I get the sense that he's the biggest burner, but obviously if the combine shows out, that it's going to make me think about that differently. But Odunze earned a lot of air yards, a lot of targets, a lot of air yards per target. Like everything makes sense for Odunze. I think the one question you have looking at these numbers is like, how much of this is just because of the offense and the fact that they were really forcing the ball downfield at a high rate, like 2.8 deep targets per game. That's one more than Harrison had per game. That's a little bit less than one more than Nabers had per game. So Odunze could be a little bit of an offensive will player, but I think he showed enough with the performance that I would still say Odunze a tier behind Harrison for sure. Harrison, I think, kind of stands on his own. But Odunze is a valid player and a guy who should have some big plays. But I want to see his athletic testing. I think it's going to be a big thing for me. If he really does well at the combine, I think we're going to feel a lot better about him. If he is not, if he doesn't test well at the combine, I think this is going to be a real deep cut. Who was the guy? Somebody in the chat's going to know this. Who was the guy that PJ Walker was throwing through when he was in the XFL? I want to say Cam Robinson or something like that. But there was a guy, basically, he was like a 6'5" guy. He was like an NFL journeyman roster guy who was just really good at getting deep targets against shitty corners and all that. Then he went to the NFL, landed on a few practice squads. And then Cam Robinson, I think was his name. But correct me, please, if somebody knows, because I really can't remember. And now I'm tempted to look it up. Fuck it. Let's look it up. Houston Roughnecks star wide receiver, PJ Walker. This guy was like a legend during one period of time in that XFL. If you guys remember the 2020 XFL season, he was putting up like 200-yard days. And now I need to find it. Cam. Let's look up Cam. No, he's not in this one. God damn it. I can't believe none of you guys are chiming in here to immediately correct me. Fuck. Well, point being, that's the comp I would have. If Odunze is not accurate or not athletic, rather, he's going to be that guy who is basically an XFL guy who can get downfield. If he is testing at like 4.4 speed and also everything else looks good, then I think Odunze is like a legit player. But that's the thing that I want to be out to look out for because the numbers look great, but I kind of think it might be a little bit of an offensive thing. So we need to keep a fact check in line for Rome Odunze as we go. Thank you for apologizing for failing me, Chunk. I guess there are just a lot of you guys, I guess, just weren't in the XFL 2020 streets where that was a highlight of my time. I was doing shows with Sal Vetri for the then Osmo at the time and really felt like that level of the XFL, one of my most understood sports where I was picking out everything, got to the Houston Roughnecks early, was riding that offense for the early parts of the year. And that wide receiver, whoever he was amazing for that 5-game stretch. He was getting like 200 yards per game. It was crazy. Anyway, Malik Nabers, let's move on to him. A little bit less size. 6 feet, 200 is the reported size. So he could be potentially 5'10", 5'11". So I think that this is for Nabers a big ding for him. If he's going to be 3 inches less tall than Rome, 4 inches less tall than Harrison, maybe more than that, because we do see guys get their height rounded up a little bit more in the college, sports books and whatever, the almanacs that people get in the media reports. So for Malik Nabers, size is one thing to watch. I think we're looking at a guy maybe he's a little bit more Garrett Wilson size than Quentin Johnston size, and I would like to see a great receiver be Quentin Johnston size. For Nabers, though, not going to critique him for that too much. 31% target per route run rate for him, 9.8 targets per game, 3.9 yards per route run. Getting a little bit less downfield in his targets, 12 intended air yards per target for him, but 115 air yards per game. And he actually had more yards per game than air yards. So he's a guy that's taking the ball, making things happen when he's got the ball in his hands. That's a positive as well for a guy who's going to be a little bit on the shorter side. We're not talking Tank Dell size, but we are talking a little bit smaller in terms of your alpha receiver. So that's one thing for Nabers that I think is important to highlight. 32% avoided tackle rate. So again, compare his numbers to Quentin Johnson, I think is a good thing to do as well. And for what it's worth too, this did jump out to me last night. Nabers made a huge leap from last year to this year, where we're talking 25% target per out run last year compared to 31% this year. Every number, 2.5 yards per out run compared to 3.9. So the one caveat I could give for Nabers is that maybe a little bit of a one-year wonder that we're not seeing the numbers be kind of flat like we are for Harrison. But I think that's something too, where obviously taking a leap is a thing that guys do in college and the NFL as well. So I think you can give him some grace, but it is a stark contrast here for what Nabers did last year compared to what he did this year. But again, avoiding tackles is a good thing for a guy who is going to have to avoid tackles as a smaller player. 0.65 EPA per target is crazy. Like, he's adding a lot of value with everything he does. Kind of a slot level of production there. And it does make sense because he's getting more targets out of the slot. 5.5 slot targets per game compared to 4.2 out wide. But he's good with both. A 0.84 EPA from the slot, 0.44 EPA out wide. Being able to move him around is a positive thing. Definitely some Jamar Chase comps I could see from Nabers in terms of just the pure metrics of it all. But for Nabers, I think things look good overall. Under 10 air yards, he was the best wide receiver in the class, it looks like. 0.394 EPA per target on 5 targets of under 10 air yards. So again, able to get those short targets, make something happen with him. That is a skill. That is a skill that allows you to compound targets in the NFL as well if the offense uses them correctly. So I think that grades out really well for Malik Nabers. 3.1 targets, 10 to 20 air yards. He had a 0.56 EPA there, so nothing concerning at all. Adding value at every level is the thing we look for. 0.394 on the short throws, 0.557 EPA on the mid-range throws, and a 1.6 EPA on deep throws, where he got 2 targets per game. So things look really good for Nabers everywhere you go. And the fact that he can get downfield and avoid tackles, I think, is a very good sign for Nabers as well. So he has a lot of merits. If I were going to critique one of these guys the most out of the top 3, I think you could point to Rome's numbers and say, like, a little bit of a video game offense, a little bit of a will thing by Washington. Nabers adding value everywhere on the field and also getting the deep targets and being better with them, I think speaks a lot to Nabers' ability. I would say because of that, I think Odunze is my number 3 guy. I like the size, but I have some questions about Odunze I need to see answered. For right now, I think it would be Harrison 1, Nabers 2. And to be clear, it's not 1A, 1B. That's 1, 2. But I think it's 1, 2, maybe 2B if Nabers is athletic, but maybe 3, or excuse me, if Odunze is athletic. But I think Odunze is probably just a flat 3 for me. Fucking Vetri. You have Sal Vetri, of course, now a man who I love, still think he's a great guy, but the social media presence of Sal Vetri is definitely a different thing. Nabers looks really good. Definitely a guy I want to dive deeper on too. Look, I think Nabers looks good. I don't have the questions about Nabers I think I have of Odunze. The one thing that Nabers could get knocked down for is just the height stuff. If he's not grading out in terms of the height and the weight, it's going to be something that hurts him a little bit in the rack athletic stuff. Of course, that we can't wait to see again all the rack testing screenshots that we're going to get for the combine. But Nabers, everything looks good here. One thing to point out, though, the red zone work, he is a pretty far cry behind Marvin Harrison. 0.74 EPA for Harrison compared to negative 0.5 for Odunze, compared to 0.06 for Nabers. So he was not great in the red zone. Do we want to blame Jaden Daniels for that? I don't know that I do, because I think Jaden Daniels is really good. So I think that the red zone stuff, a little bit of a concern for Nabers. But if you're that good downfield and also that good earning targets and creating value with short targets, I don't have to hold him too accountable for not being as good in the red zone, I think. But he got the work, 1.5 red zone targets per game, 0.6 inside the 10-yard line per game. Just could be better with it, I think, is the main thing here. So he's not Devontae Adams, not going to be like a red zone beast or anything, at least early in his career. But I think we've seen enough. So these are 3 studs. I think really, if nothing else, again, the questions I have with Odunze, Harrison's a stud. I think Nabers is a stud. Those are 2 guys that when that big board hits in a month or I guess like 3 weeks, you should be hammering these guys pretty early. Obviously, we'll see what the ADPs go for them. If they're priced a little bit too aggressively, I think that could be a question. But if like Harrison is priced where JSN was last year and Nabers is somehow close to where Quentin Johnston was last year, I think those guys are both like much better picks of those ADPs. And Harrison, I think you can go up to where Christian Watson went last year, and I'd be completely in on Harrison as well. Nabers, pushing it. Nabers can get to where JSN was, and I think I'd still feel confident in that. Landing spot's going to be the key thing, though, but there's nothing here that says, like, these guys are going to bust to me compared to a guy like Jonathan Mingo. If you guys remember, I hated Jonathan Mingo last year, and we can look at his numbers as well just to kind of reflect back on that. Mingo last year, yeah, 0.13 EPA per target. Really bad target under 25% target per out run rate. Negative EPA playing out of the slot. Of course, we got a lot of his targets this year. Bad EPA playing downfield, just a 0.41 despite getting 2 deep targets per game. There are things you could point out with these guys, and draft capital is going to matter a lot more. But I think that when you don't see any flaws with guys and you do see just mostly positives, they're then going in saying like, okay, this is now a guy we can trust. Where's he going to land? If Marvin Harrison lands with like the Bengals as a new T. Higgins, like then he's probably worth what T. Higgins is, but he's not going to have the same apex as he would have if he lands on a team where he gets to be Jamar Chase or he gets to be Justin Jefferson. So I think that's something to keep in mind here. But for Harrison, for Odunze, for Nabers, like just the numbers, the analytics from SIS, there's nothing here that I dislike. So that's where that is. Cam Phillips, Houston Rob. There we go. It's Cam Phillips. I always think Cam Robinson, but it's Cam Phillips. Thank you. Historical anomalies. And Cam Phillips was, in fact, a historical anomaly. So it's an appropriate person to be giving us that info. But yeah, he was great, man. Basically wiped from the record books. It's so sad, man, because that was honestly, that Houston Roughnecks offense was the most fun football offense I think that's ever existed, besides maybe the Dolphins offense in that Broncos game. Like, I think that was one. And that Rams Chiefs game a couple of years ago, they got moved from Mexico City to LA. Those are like the most fun offenses that have ever existed. But that Roughnecks one, man, PJ Walker, you would have told me was a dude. And then we've seen him play this year and he's not a dude anymore. Keon Coleman here. So Keon Coleman, I'm not impressed. And actually, I think that there's Johnny Wilson to me stands out a lot more out of the FSU guys. But Keon Coleman here, 27% target per out run rate, not great. 4.2 catches per game, not great on 7.5 targets. 90 air yards per game, not great. Again, he's getting as many routes per game basically as Marvin Harrison, but looking a lot worse. Those are not positive things to see. 0.003 EPA per target is outright bad. And I think for a guy who's 6'4", he's going to probably get some eyeballs because he's going to have that big body type, that prototypical receiver look that we look for. But these are all really poor numbers by Keon Coleman. And you know, I don't know where you guys stand on the Florida State debate. I personally think that Florida State, from what I know, was one of those teams where they lose their QB. QB drove a lot of success, but the team itself was not one where it's like, this is actually a good team. So I was okay with them not making the playoffs. Sorry to the many Florida State fans I have in my life for some reason. A lot of my closest friends went to Florida State. But like, Keon Coleman is showing nothing here. Like, these numbers, you are talking a chasm between Harrison, Odunze, and Nabers and Keon Coleman. And honestly, just even Harrison, like I would put Harrison 4 tiers above Coleman. That said, you know, he comes out pretty highly graded in the mock draft, so we'll see what he does at the combine. But Coleman's a guy that I think right now, like, you look at these numbers and there's nothing that stands out as noteworthy. Go Knowles. Yeah, go Knowles. Like, great people coming out of FSU. I'll give you guys that. But I don't know, man. I think Keon Coleman is really showing nothing to me in these numbers. The 0.094 EPA downfield, that's aggressively bad. Getting 2.1 targets per game, that low of an EPA. And again, he had his primary QB for most of the year, and that QB was really good. So I would say, or, you know, really good relatively to a college QB. Keon Coleman, I think is awful. I guess the one thing you can point to that is a little bit of positive for him in the red zone, looking a little better, 1.1 red zone targets per game, good for a 0.26 EPA. Inside a 10-yard line, a 0.99 EPA. So he is a big go up and get him guy, which fits with what Historical Anomalies is saying here, that he played basketball at Michigan State. So again, basketball players, like we know the Jimmy Grahams of the world, the Antonio Gates is like those guys in the red zone, that's automatic. So that's the positive for Keon Coleman. But if you're bad everywhere else in the field, but good in the red zone, I don't know how that's going to help you out. Supposedly didn't practice the last month because of injuries, but played through. Take that for what you will. But what about the rest of the year? Because like, he should still have pretty good numbers the rest of the year, and he doesn't. And so one thing you could say is that he's big, has a high avoided tackle rate. But like, to me, his numbers look scarily like Quentin Johnston's from last year. And I don't want to fall into that trap again of just liking a guy because he's big and can avoid tackles at a decent clip. And, you know, and honestly, you know, Quentin Johnston avoided more tackles and that added no value to his game this year in the NFL. So Keon Coleman would be the first guy I would say looking kind of busty, looking not the good kind of busty either. Looking just not like a player that I'd want to gravitate towards. And I don't know. We'll see where he goes ADP wise. We'll see where he goes. But I would say in the mock drafts, he's the wide receiver 4. I don't think he's my wide receiver 4. And he was no better last year either. Slightly better, it looks like in some metrics, but 0.22 EPA, it's just not doing wonders for me for a guy. And it's not like, again, it's not like this is his first year coming from college basketball. Like, he's played 2 years of getting a lot of snaps. I might have played more. I only pulling the last 2 years. But like for Keon Coleman, I'm not wowed by anything of it. Egbuka is a guy that I think has more in 2023, did not qualify in terms of his targets this year. Of course, Ohio State fed Marvin Harrison a lot, so that's possible that would be the case. Egbuka seems to me like a guy that looks like a worse version of JSN in an offense that clearly does reward the slot pretty well. Egbuka, 0.34 EPA under 10 air yards, 0.704 EPA 10 to 20 air yards, not getting enough deep targets to qualify there. In the red zone, he's whatever. What's Egbuka's size? Claims to be 6'1". He injured all year. His 2023 numbers do look a little bit better. Egbuka last year, 0.49 EPA. I think the best case you could make for him is like a slightly bigger Josh Downs, I guess would be it. Obviously, depends where he grades out because they do have him listed at 6'1" here. That could be 5'11" in actual combine measurements. But Egbuka, I think the hope for you would be that you get a JSN or a Josh Downs out of him. I'm not seeing anything here, either in his 2023 numbers or his 2024 numbers, that make me think he's like a world beater. I think he's a quality slot in a class where we know last year there are a lot of quality slots. Some of them did okay. Some of them kind of didn't do a whole lot. I think that's where I put Egbuka, where if he's not playing out wide and adding value, he's just a slot guy, and slot guys are kind of interchangeable. And again, we saw even with draft capital, like slot guys did not get to this year with JSN. And I think that's the main thing, is that I think Egbuka is just a worse JSN. So if he lands somewhere good, he's fine, but I'm not dying for Egbuka. Let's see. Coleman had a solid QB with Travis. Duggan was ass cheeks. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's fair, but so then that should honestly give more reasons to doubt Coleman, because Quentin Johnson had pretty good numbers with Max Duggan, whereas like for Coleman, like he's had mid numbers with a QB that's supposed to be better. So I don't know. Adonai Mitchell coming out of Texas. Not a lot of routes per game, 28. I mean, I guess it's a difference of 4, but less routes per game than you'd like to see. Target rate so low, 23% target per route run rate. If you can't earn targets in college, you're not going to earn targets in the pros, and that's kind of a main thing we need to really tattoo on our foreheads to keep in mind moving forward. Adonai Mitchell, really nothing good here. 3.3 yards after catch. Big body dude at 6'4", but also kind of slender at 196 if that's actually his weight. Would imagine he's probably closer to like 180-ish if he's being billed at 196. 0.36 EP out wide is okay. Just not an alpha target earner is what Adonai Mitchell is. So to me, that's kind of a thing right away where I'd strike him from the record books in terms of a guy of like prioritizing. 0.34 EPA under 10 air yards. 0.25 EPA 10 to 20 air yards. 0.593 downfield. Not a lot to love there. In the red zone, a negative EPA, 0.5 EPA inside the 10-yard line. Excuse me, Jesus. Too many stats make me extra mumble mouth. Adonai Mitchell, I don't know. I liked Ewers and his numbers, and Adonai Mitchell did not seem to be the one driving Ewers' numbers in any meaningful way. He's okay. Like if Adonai Mitchell lands in a good spot, I think that's okay. At least he's better than Jonathan Mingo. But just this 23% target per out run rate when you're running 28 routes per game, that's not great. So I think for Mitchell, size seems okay. Numbers seem okay. You got to earn more targets, and he did not do that well enough for me to really plant a flag for him in any meaningful way. Tell me this wide receiver class isn't as deep as we've been told all season. I mean, it's deep in terms of you could talk yourself into guys. And again, there's one guy on the screen that we've not talked about yet that I really think stands out in the numbers. But I think, there's guys who are okay. The depth to me is having 3 potential stud receivers, and it all comes down to if Odunze's athletics are going to be there, and I guess if Nabers' size is going to be there. But if those 2 things are there for those guys, like that's where the depth is, that you could have 3 potential like number 1 true alpha receivers in the class, and a couple of like passable guys. But nothing's wowing me so far of the other guys. Adonai's a beast in the red zone, can make plays that he continues to develop, and landing spot will be the key to unlocking his value. I mean, he wasn't a beast in the red zone overall. Was a beast inside the 10-yard line, but like you can't have a negative EPA in the red zone and be a beast. Like he got touchdowns, I guess that. So you might be talking about the results part of it. Again, the size is there. Like how young is Adonai Mitchell? If he's like 21, I'd feel better about him than if he's at 23. All right, so he's at 21. What's his birthday? Can't find his birthday easily, and I'm not going to spend too much time looking at Adonai Mitchell's birthday. The point being, like younger guys, you could grow into it a little bit more, but just the target earning, man, you can't have a 23% target per out run rate. That's like we're talking second worst in the class. That's not great for Adonai. Malachi Corley coming out of Western Kentucky, small guy, built at 5'11", so we're probably talking 5'9". Alpha target earner though, 35%. When I looked at Malachi Corley's numbers, I kind of thought Let's go back. Where's our old Nathaniel here? Although I might have removed Tank Dell at some point. Let's put in Tank Dell really fast, just so we can compare. Nathaniel Dell. So Tank last year, you know what? His target rate wasn't as high as no, 30% target rate. So yeah, Tank, 30% target rate, 12 targets per game, 118 air yards per game. Conley, lower air yards for sure. So that is one thing. The volume of targets stands out in a Tank Dell kind of way. The downfield stuff, not as much, where it's 5.7 to 10 air yards per attempt is really low. We're kind of talking more of a Wan'Dale Robinson average depth of target there. But not bad numbers. Earning targets close to the line of scrimmage. Could be a PPR guy, probably a little bit less valuable in a DraftKings. 7.5 slot targets per game. Not a high EPA, though. 0.074 EPA per target there. Here we go. Here's our guy, Al. Corley had 103 screen targets, converted cornerback to running back, now wide receiver. Okay. So that makes sense. So not a downfield guy. Very much a gadgety guy, but a gadgety guy in kind of a Curtis Samuel-y way. EPA is not great. 0.13 EPA, not really standing out. 0.074 EPA in the slot, not really standing out. Negative 0.01 EPA. So you know what? Actually, alpha target earner, but not doing enough of it to really cape for, especially given that he's playing at Western Kentucky. If you're playing at a lower tier, would really like to see, again, that high-level target earning along with a high EPA. That's what Rashee Rice was able to do. For a guy like Corley, low size, low pedigree, not a great school. To me, I think those are a lot of things against him unless he lands at an offense where, like, get a Tank Dell kind of situation. Don't think he's Tank Dell, though, because of the way that they play. Target earning, though, very impressive. Xavier Worthy, 30 routes per game, 8.6 targets per game, 29% target per out run rate. So we're basically closer to where Quentin Johnston, where JSN, where Jordan Addison were last year. Only a 0.124 EPA, though, 7.8 yards after catch. Yeah, Worthy, nothing really to write home about here. And then, and I guess if you want to give some cover to Adonai Mitchell, it's not like Worthy's doing a lot more. In fact, he's doing a lot less than Mitchell did in the same offense. So I guess that's a fair point for Worthy. Yeah, negative 0.02 or 0.002 EPA per target under 10 air yards. Did play both out wide and in the slot, but slightly positive EPAs for both, not really adding a ton of value in either part of the field. I don't know. I would say more like Xavier Unworthy. I'm sorry. But and really bad in the red zone. Negative 0.66 EPA in the red zone, getting his 0.9 targets. Negative 1.5 EPA, getting a target within 10 air yards or within the 10-yard line. Man, Worthy to me, worst version of Adonai Mitchell. Mitchell, you could talk me into. Worthy, I don't think you could talk me into very much, even though fine wide receiver name. Western Kentucky's a volume offense where Zappy and Osarito throw 400 yards per game. Oh, yeah, so there you go. So another thing to nickel and dime Malachi Corley on, but again, he was CBS's number 6 overall prospect. So I don't know, take it up with CBS. Lad McConkey, don't have numbers for him because he did not earn enough targets. Kind of chunky white guy is Lad McConkey, I think, or at the very least fat-faced white guy. I don't think we need Lad McConkey in our lives. Let's move on. Troy Franklin is the guy that I really am curious about. 31% target per out run rate, 9 targets per game, 117 air yards per game. Convert that to 106 actual yards, 0.703 EPA. Now, Oregon, a little video gaming, I guess we could say. Definitely, we saw with Bo Nix's numbers last week that he's really not throwing it downfield a lot. So I guess for whatever you want to give Troy Franklin credit for, it's a really high EPA for a guy that's not just feasting downfield necessarily, but a 0.703 EPA, not avoiding tackles too much, but is getting 13 intended air yards per attempt, so getting downfield pretty well in his targets. I like that for Franklin. Is also playing out wide, 6.6 targets out wide, good for a 0.62 EPA there. 5.2 targets under 10 air yards, good for a 0.37 EPA. 2 intended targets per game, 10 to 20 air yards, 0.9 EPA there. 1.8 deep targets per game, good for a 1.2 EPA. To me, he grades out like he should be the number 4 wide receiver in the class. Troy Franklin, I think, is a 6-foot flat guy. No, he's 6'3". So he's got size. He's got height at least, not weight at 187. Franklin, to me, looks really good. So these numbers all grade out well. Again, getting positive values every part of the field and really top of the class values every part of the field. In the red zone, a little bit less good, only a 0.3 EPA there, only getting 1 red zone target a game. So that's the part that I think does put him behind Harrison, put him behind Nabers, put him behind Odunze. But Troy Franklin, I think, is as good as everybody else we've talked about here who aren't the top 3. So Franklin, to me, is a guy. And, again, draft capital matters a lot here. Trey Palmer graded out well for me last year. We saw Palmer actually get in the field and be somewhat useful, but he didn't get enough work. Hutchinson was a guy I liked. He didn't get the draft capital. So I think that's the one caveat you have to have, where Troy Franklin has to go top 2 rounds, top 3 rounds to really feel confidence, or you need to have like that CJ Stroud, Tank Dell thing where it's like, oh, these two guys were working out together and he insisted on taking them. Like that maybe gets Troy Franklin a little more juice if he doesn't get drafted highly. But Franklin's numbers to me look incredibly elite. So we'll see what happens with him in terms of combine testing. But if I were to make a bet on any of these guys who aren't top 3 to really surge upwards, Franklin at 6'3", and if he has like any sort of speed at all, he earns targets, he does things with them, high CPA per target in the class. These are all things for Troy Franklin that matter a lot. So I think Franklin looks really good. Troy Franklin, sneaky good here. There we go. I'd like to hear that. Franklin's a guy I need to know more about. Looked good in some big games. Only concern is Pac-12 defenses, sure. Yes, the defenses are not good, but I don't know. He earned targets. He made the most of them. I think that's all you can ask of a guy. Franklin, the Cowboys, maybe. I mean, do you want to just roll, I guess, Gallup and Tolbert into one role and I guess maybe Cooks? I guess if you do that, Franklin makes sense, but he's honestly such a good target earner that he might actually put a little bit of a ding in CeeDee Lamb because 30% plus target per out run rate, I would say like for rookies, like that 30% mark does feel like an important one to get over if you can. Musa Muhammad, don't have the numbers for him. He was okay playing out the slot. I presume his dad is Musa Muhammad, the former receiver who played for the Panthers, some other teams, maybe the Bears. But Musa Muhammad, don't have enough numbers for him, but he looks okay. If he really steams upwards, we can look more at it. Do I have drop numbers in the advanced stats? I don't look up drop numbers because I think that they're a little bit of a noisy stat, and I think people obsess over them a little bit too much. So I don't put them in. I kind of think that drop numbers like end up affecting draft capital more so. So you can make a case that I should put them in, but I don't track them for the NFL. I don't track them for college either because I just don't think they matter that much. My terrible take. I only look at hand size and arm length for rookies, trying to be better. Look, I mean, the rack scores matter, but I think for wide receivers, target earning, EPA production, like those are the main things that I think help us get ahead of bad receivers. And also, again, find the ones that are actually going to be good this year, even though, this year, not a lot paid off. Johnny Wilson. Johnny Wilson is 6'7". Watched some Johnny Wilson film to try to make sense of him to see if it was just gimmicky shit. 7 targets per game on 20 routes per game. That means a 36% target per out run rate. So he's actually the most targeted player out of anybody in this draft class or potential draft class. 0.374 EPA per target is pretty good, especially for a 6'7" guy. 5.9 targets per game out wide. Good for a 0.26 EPA there. Would be nice to see him be a little bit better. But again, he's a lot better looking than Keon Coleman. And Keon Coleman we have at 6'4". So like Coleman's size, I think, is what's driving his value. I think Johnny Wilson, more size and seemingly a better receiver in the analytics. So I think that for Johnny Wilson, some good things here. Like he avoided tackles too. A 24% avoided tackle rate for a 6'7" guy is like kind of crazy because you expect him to be just taking hits right at the legs over and over again, being that tall. But he did pretty well with what he got on the year. 3.6 targets of 10 to 20 air yards. That's also interesting to see. Did not get targeted enough to qualify short of 10 air yards. Not qualify enough downfield either. So definitely would like to get a better read on that. It's also not used enough in the red zone to qualify, so that's not great. But the raw numbers for Johnny Wilson, if we were going to say who's the Puka of the class, Franklin, I guess, is too known of a quality to beat a Puka, or too known of a quantity to be the Puka. I think that Johnny Wilson might be the Puka here, or at least one of the potential Pukas, just because of that high level of targets. The fact that like completely different players, because Johnny Wilson's enormous and Puka's not enormous. But just earning that level of targets is pretty impressive. That level of air yards as well when running 10 less routes per game than a lot of guys in this class. I think Johnny Wilson stands out. So he's got to test well. He's almost too big for receiver at 6'7". But I think that for Wilson, he's kind of interesting here. And again, draft capital is going to matter the most. And what's Johnny Wilson's age? Johnny Wilson, 22. So that's also not great. Definitely a little bit on the older side. Next one, find the Puka. Sounds like a Tyler game. Yes, I agree. And Al, glad Al got the spreadsheets again. Al wanted into the data last week, asked me about it in the comments, and I just paid for a membership. And of course, if you want to check out the data here, Sports Info Solutions has all the data that you could possibly want. That's where I pull my stuff from. But my data sheet will be going to you guys. Of course, if you hit that join button down below, $4.99 a month, we'll drop these right after the show. If you guys want to look at them for both the 2024 numbers and 2023 numbers, we'll be dropping that for the paid members. Xavier Legette. 30 routes per game, 28% targets per route run. Good air yards guy. Good EPA, 0.52, but not a big target earner. Kind of makes me want to nickel and dime him for that. Better out of the slot, but did play both out wide and in the slot. 4.3 targets out wide compared to 3.6 in the slot. 0.32 EPA out wide compared to 0.76 in the slot. Again, slot targets could be more efficient, so that's nothing too surprising there. Got downfield pretty well. 1.1 EPA on deep throws. 0.9 EPA in the middle of the field or the middle range past the sticks. So that's okay. Legette looks fine to me. Would need to know more about him in terms of his size and his ability. 6'3", 227 is the build size. That's pretty big for a guy who's that good in the slot. Legette, I think I like Legette. I like Legette. If I were to, again, grade these guys, Legette to me stands out more than Coleman, than Egbuka, than Adonai Mitchell, than Worthy. I think Legette looks like a solid play, but again, would like to see him earn a few more targets here to feel a little bit safer about it. But added value at every level. If he's 6'3" and 227, that's really good size as well. The risk is that he could be like a Cedric Tillman type where you just get hard to get on the field if the draft capital's not there. But again, able to play out wide, out of the slot, get results on both. Looking at the numbers, and again, this is going to be a hot take, kind of feel like the numbers look a little AJ Brownie. Just the ability to move in both areas of the field, create production downfield, have the big body as well, and make that happen. I know this is what we talked about last year with Mingo, where Mingo to me looks like AJ Brown visually, where you see him built and you're like, what the fuck? This guy Mingo is like carved out of stone. And you look at the numbers and it's like, you don't do anything like AJ Brown. I don't know what Legette looks like. Let's see. Let's look up Xavier Legette. Do I just go Xavier Legette shirtless? I don't know. You big dude. Yeah, that's a big man. That's a big man. Big dude, muscle, could move around the field. I kind of like Legette. I think he's a player to watch. Again, probably one of those guys too that in the big board and the tournaments that are coming up in the earliest parts of the season probably doesn't even get drafted. So taking a few flyers on Legette, I think is a pretty good move. You see the video going around with the guy hot taking that Odunze would be better than MHJ. I mean, that's everybody. I don't know. Nothing too surprising about that stuff. I think that it's like anything in DFS where it's like, okay, what's the most likely outcome? What's like the chalk outcome? Chalk outcome is Marvin Harrison being great. Of course, you're going to get more money and get more, more notoriety by saying, oh, this lower probability outcome is the one that hits. And if it does hit, people remember it. So like, that's just fucking content. I don't even think that guy would actually believe that. Okay, we got one without the pants too. No, Big Lenny. Unfortunately, we cannot do that. He's a late bloomer. Okay, that's fine. Have to say Alshon Jeffrey. All right. I mean, Alshon Jeffrey had a few good years. But again, the athletic testing is going to be the stuff for a lot of these guys. We're Legette if he has good numbers, but he doesn't have great combine stuff. Like he's not going to get up enough to really have the draft capital to matter. But if a guy like Legette has really good testing metrics, and he looks like that, and he's got size, he could move up. Tory Horton would be another guy too. Faint. Who's the Puka of this year vibes? Highest target per out run rate besides Johnny Wilson here, 35.5% target per out run, 11 targets per game, 8 catches per game, 120 air yards per game. 0.142 EPA is not the best for Puka. We did have an outlier metric there where Puka was at a 0.33 EPA per target despite getting low targets. So I think that's the one that you could say that makes him not the Puka potentially. Negative 0.05 EPA out wide as well. So just a really good target earner. Really good target earners, again, matter sometimes in that transition to the pros, but the metrics here are not adding a ton of value. So he needs to land at a spot that's going to feed him and use him and really, I guess, embrace his ability. And that's something where if you're not creating the EPA value, you need to land in the right spot that's going to nurture you along. And for a guy like Puka, he got both of those where he had the EPA value, had the high target per out run rate, lands on a team where they really needed somebody like him and then used him accordingly. For a guy like Horton, coming in from Colorado State, he's got to land in the right spot. He's got to have that kind of equivalency, and maybe he can be a little more valuable. But added positive EPAs at every level of the field, it looks like, besides downfield, negative 0.01 EPA there. I personally don't love guys who have a negative EPA downfield because I just think their ability to not have those splash plays, of course, fucking name of the show, splash play. So kind of speaks for itself. But the inability to have those big plays downfield just make you a little bit less interesting than me as a receiver. If that's all you do, of course, that's not great. But for Horton and not be able to get downfield, I think that's how it is. Okay, we sort by EPA. If you're a paying member, you can. I'm not going to do it on stream. No offense, of course, but like it's just there's no point to me in doing that. But Horton to me looks pretty good. Actually, did pretty well in short spaces as well. Within the 10-yard line, 0.81 EPA. Of course, only 0.6 targets per game is not the biggest sample size. But Horton, I think, a little bit better than some of these other guys we looked at in terms of the metrics, in terms of the ability to play in different parts of the field. And again, 6'2" size is not anything to sneeze at either. So Horton, a guy to watch, I think, even though would like him to be a little bit better if I'm going to really plant the flag and say like Horton's going to be, potential Puka guy. Like, I don't think that's the case. Mario Williams, too small, did not qualify in terms of his targets. It's one of those guys moving over from Oklahoma, thought that he would matter more for USC this year, and he didn't. Kind of got lapped by all the younger guys. So for me, for Mario Williams, nothing I'm really standing up for here. Did have some amount of pedigree, though. Like, it was a big deal that he went from Oklahoma to USC. He just didn't really have the success. And obviously, nothing on USC did this year. Mario Williams being 5'9" and also not standing out when I watched any games this year, and him not qualifying numerically here. I think for Mario Williams, there's not a lot for me to go off of. Brian Thomas Jr., way too low. A lot of talk him going in the first round. Yes, this is where he ranks. He is CBS's wide receiver 16 here. Brian Thomas, again, not a great target earner. 23% target per route run rate, ran a lot of routes at LSU. He did have talent around him, though. We, of course, talked about Malik Nabers earlier, so maybe that's why Thomas got less work, but had a really high EPA, 0.63 EPA playing at LSU this year, 0.55 EPA playing out wide, so was playing out wide, which is harder to have that high EPA. Did have that for himself. Added value at every level of the field as well, 0.18 EPA under 10 air yards, 0.32 EPA, 10 to 20 air yards, 1.7 EPA, highest in the class downfield. So Brian Thomas, the best downfield performer we've talked about so far. Good in the red zone as well, 0.754 EPA and a 1.2 EPA inside the 10-yard line. So I agree. Like, Brian Thomas looks pretty good. I wish he were earning targets, a little more volume. I think is the one thing for Brian Thomas. What's his age? He is 21. Okay, so young enough. Definitely better to see that at 21 than if you were at 22 or 23. Where was 2023 numbers? Brian Thomas did not do enough to qualify last year. Yeah, I like Brian Thomas. I mean, 6'4", putting up these numbers is good. Again, just the target earning is an issue. Like, if he and Nabers were both at like 28%, I would say that that's a little bit more covered for Brian Thomas, where like, okay, like these guys are both a little bit low because they have a great receiver across from them. Instead, Brian Thomas was kind of being used as a lever off of Nabers, where Nabers is getting targeted a lot more volume in every part of the field. And then Brian Thomas is kind of getting to cherry pick some of the better targets downfield and make the most of them. So I guess it's the one critique point for Brian Thomas, but I wish he earned more targets because I think that makes it easier to really stand up and go, all right, this guy is it. But 7 targets a game at LSU with a stud receiver across from him, I think Brian Thomas has some merit. So Brian Thomas, I think a good player. I would say for me, a comparable amount of intrigue for me with Brian Thomas and Johnny Wilson. Still don't think Brian Thomas, like, I have more questions about him than the top 3 because he's just not that alpha target earner. But I think still, like, he should not be 16 when we have guys like guys who didn't even earn enough targets to like qualify in a top 100 receiver data export. I don't think should be ranked at all, or should be ranked much lower, at least by CBS. And instead, they have these guys up there. To me, I would say that I think Brian Thomas, because he got more work, I would say that Brian Thomas would be probably my wide receiver 5 out of this group. I'd put him behind Harrison, put him behind Odunze, put him behind Nabers. I would also put him behind Troy Franklin. But I think that that Thomas and Troy Franklin, or excuse me, Thomas and Johnny Wilson would be like my guy for number 5, I think would be it. For what it's worth, Thomas is Mel Kiper's 17th overall. Okay. I mean, I get, look, the combine can really put a guy like this over the top. If he has really raw, like amazing raw athletic testing stuff, like he's going to come up a lot, being 6'4", especially, coming from LSU, playing real competition. But you do have to kind of just watch out for, like, did he come along for the ride because Nabers was so good and also Jaden Daniels was so good, or is he himself good? And I think the athletic profile will be a thing that helps tiebreak that. But everything looks good numerically, so I can't argue it. But I do Tez Walker. Tez Walker is not on the CBS list. Let's see. Let's see if he's in the data. Does he have a long form name? Oh, Devontae Walker is it? Okay. Devontae Walker. Not a great target earner. 36 routes per game, though. A lot of air yards. he just converted a lot of air yards. Again, this is me just going off the cuff here because who is that? Because Christian's asking about it. Really seems to be like he just capitalized on a lot of high volume work downfield. Not good in EPA metrics. Okay, like he's okay out wide, I guess, but these numbers 0.292, 10 to 20 air yards, 0.27 EPA downfield don't really do it for me, along with being only a 25% target per out run rate guy. That much air yards is impressive, but that's like a will stat. That's like having Jameis Winston a couple years ago for the Bucs. Like there were weeks where Brashad Perriman was like, to me, a top graded wide receiver because he was getting 300 air yards per game. Justin Watson filling in, getting 300 air yards per game. It's easy to be a good receiver if you get that many air yards, but I think for Devonta's or for Tez here, like 162 air yards is the most in the class, and he only converted them into 87. That's awful. That's a really bad rate for Devonta's. Walker missed half the season for academic reasons, transferred for Kent State's UNC to play with May. Should be a day 2 pick. Yeah, I feel like from what I'm seeing here and what I know of Drake May as well, Tez is just the vessel for Drake May's willingness to throw downfield. So like kind of the equivalent of a Nico Collins, except like much worse than Nico because he's not actually adding value with the catches. But like if you have 162 air yards, you're only converting them to 87. Like that's basically, you're just like a pure dart throw guy. And I think that's not it for me. J. Michael Sturdivant, is that his name? I don't even fucking know. Hold on, I gotta fucking put that. Okay, Sturdivant, there we go. J. Michael Sturdivant, I don't know. Nothing impressive here. 20% target rate is really bad. Negative 0.15 EPA, really bad. Negative 0.27 EPA out wide, really bad. I don't know why he's on this list, to be honest, but he's on CBS's list. So he's a guy, he's 6'3", good size, I guess, but a bad target earner who didn't add value with his targets and actively took value away. A worse version of Jonathan Mingo looks like J. Michael Sturdivant, so he would not be somebody I would want to target. Jalin Polk, 25% target rate, not doing it for me. 0.34 EPA is fine. 0.59 EPA out wide is fine. 0.12 EPA in the slot, not great. Just definitely be more efficient in the slot than you are out wide. Polk's numbers look okay, I guess, in terms of the actual EPA numbers. 0.95 EPA downfield, 0.42 EPA, 10 to 20 air yards. A 1 flat EPA and throws inside the 10-yard line. Yeah, Polk to me, okay. Obviously, Odunze, a much better tier. This kind of feels like the homeless man's version of that Brian Thomas, Malik Nabers thing, where Polk to me looks worse than Brian Thomas does. Odunze looks a little bit more, at least I have more questions about Odunze than I do Nabers. Polk's okay, but I think I don't want to shit on Polk because, again, Penix's numbers weren't that great either in terms of the advanced metrics. But Polk, yeah, I think a worse version of Brian Thomas, I think, is what I'd see in terms of being a number 2. Do stats measure average separation per route? No, I don't look at that. You can, but I think separation stats are a little bit overrated personally. Because like guys like DeAndre Hopkins, if you graded him on separation stats, he would have never ranked for you. Like contested catches are a major skill. George Pickens, same thing. So I'm not a separation guy. Jermaine Burton does not have enough in here to qualify, but he did have a 0.76 EPA out wide, 0.75 EPA in the red zone, 1.1 EPA inside the 10-yard line. So Jermaine Burton, did he do anything in 2023? No, he didn't. Not getting enough targets for Jermaine Burton. So that's, again, not a good sign. But Jermaine Burton did produce, so somebody to note, but definitely more of a note than I think Aeneas Smith, who seems kind of like a mid receiver. Not much more to note there. I think that covers it. Anything else you guys want me to look up here? Penix spreads the ball around so well. Might speak to Polk and McMillan not jumping off the stat sheet, I guess. I know. I think Fantasy Football Garage is one of the guys in the bag for Michael Penix, and I was really not impressed by the numbers for Penix. He definitely, and I think then for him to have that game on Monday night too, after looking at the numbers, is really a tough combo for me to dig out of for Penix, where I like gunslingers, but I don't think he's a good gunslinger. So yeah, if you want to give these guys a bump because maybe Penix is not as good as it seemed, I think that's something you can do. My takeaways, I guess, let's close it out with that. I think that Harrison is a clear number 1, as I mentioned earlier. Like, he's the stud receiver. He's the guy that should go above everybody else. Not bringing anything new here, but there's literally nothing to look at the numbers and go, yeah, maybe you could question this. Like, it's odd that he's not great 10 to 20 air yards. Besides that, though, like, everything else looks great. Like, I think it's really an interesting spot for Marvin Harrison, no matter where he goes in terms of ADP. So I would take Marvin Harrison no matter what. Odunze, I do want to see the athletic profile. I want to see him test out and confirmed to me that he's not Cam Phillips of the XFL. Houston Roughnecks. Shout out our guy, Historical Anomalies, for getting me the right name on that one. I want to see confirmation that he's not just a gimmick player who got 155 air yards per game because Washington wanted to throw downfield, because Penix wanted to throw downfield. Some efficiency, really big efficiency concerns for Odunze. That said, if he runs a 4.5, if he tests well and everything, if the rack scores match up, he's still a top 3 receiver. But I have questions about him. He'd be my wide receiver 3. Malik Nabers, would love to see him be a little bit bigger, but I think there are a lot of comps to a Garrett Wilson, to a Jamar Chase. His ability to move around the formation, I think, looks really good. Nabers to me is my clear number 2 receiver, and I would put Odunze number 3. Other guys to plant a flag for, Troy Franklin, I think, is one. Johnny Wilson, I'm intrigued by. Need to see more about him. Need to see him go through the full testing as well and see where the draft capital aligns. But being 6'7" and actually having some positive metrics, I think stand out. Troy Franklin was the one that really stood out to me, that I think he should be the wide receiver 4 off the board. And if Odunze is just kind of a big slug, I think that there's a shot that Troy Franklin should be, at least in terms of how you're grading it, should be your number 3 receiver in terms of the draft prospects. Obviously, we'll see how that goes. A lot of work to go, of course, in terms of these guys for themselves, as well as our prep work here. But I think that Troy Franklin really stood out to me. Brian Thomas looks good. I have some questions about being that number 2 guy with a really great alpha receiver. Brian Thomas would definitely say he's a guy to keep an eye on. Everybody else here, they can kind of skip. Adonai Mitchell, maybe, but not enough for me to really feel confident in. I think it really comes down to that, like, this class has at least 2 stud wide receivers. And I think that's Marvin Harrison and Malik Nabers. Potentially 3 if Odunze does have the athletics that fit. But I really think this is a year where, especially if people do drive down ADPs because of how the rookies performed last year, this is a year I think to heavy up on rookies. I'm a rookie lover. I talk about here. I'm a flawed person, much like everybody doing fantasy football content. Shiny new toy stands out to me. I love it. I get excited about it. And I think for LSU guys, some questions, because Jaden Daniels is so great. He was CJ Stroud with Anthony Richardson's mobility. Like that's what happened last year. But I think there's a lot of guys that can really make or break your year this year potentially. And I think Marvin Harrison, if he lands in the right spot, can walk on the field and be a 1,400-yard receiver, 1,500-yard receiver, because he's that good. So that's my main takeaways here. So guys, if you can, please do smash that like button down below. Of course, subscribe if you can. Splash Play, about 40% of people right now, maybe 45%, are not subscribed to Splash Play, but watch every video. So please, if you are one of those people, if you watch every video, help us out here. Hit that subscribe button. Keep us growing the channel. And of course, smash that like button no matter what. Helps us get seen by more people. That's always the goal here on Splash Play, so we can make this into a real viable business as we keep growing here every day. Of course, if you want all the data I just showed on screen, hit that join button down below like all these fine folks have. They get all of my data along with VIP access to the channel, along with whatever questions they want to send me too. That's what you get as part of being a member here on Splash Play. So hit that join button down below. And of course, check out Probably as well. Again, Probably data crushing. We track the winningest sports books around the world to find the best bets every day, every sport, every league. That's how it goes. Use that promo code SPLASH, save 50% on there. And really, if you want to build your bankroll for the big board, you want to build your bankroll to be doing a season of best ball drafting or whatever you do in terms of that, sports betting is a good way to do that. And I know that sounds crazy, but like if you are taking a mathematically profitable approach, a plus EV betting approach, you are going to be able to build that bankroll more efficiently. That's how I paid for my DraftKings outlay last year. It's what I'm going to do this year again. So use our data at Probably. And again, promo code SPLASH. Really, your signups matter a lot to us right now. So get on board there and please do sign up. Of course, follow me at Chris Spags. Follow the show at Splash Play Pod. Shouts to the chat for helping me think through all the stuff. Of course, college football, not my primary focus, but I do the best I can to use this data to find the takes that we need to win money. So it's always the goal here. I'll be back with you guys tomorrow for more playoff best ball drafts. And yes, we'll even hit DraftKings again tomorrow. So I will be hanging from the rafters, much like a championship banner by the end of it. But I will see you guys then. Enjoy your days. And of course, good luck. Bye.